Chapter 6. Charlotte spent the afternoon cooking and cleaning her home. She'd planned to take Sundays off now that Earl was there, but he insisted on starting to put in the garden, even though it was still below freezing at night. While he plowed, Walt walked along beside him, one hand on the plow, to help with the workload. Every time Charlotte looked out the window, she could see a huge grin on her son's face, and finally, she stopped where she was and said a quick prayer to thank God for sending Earl into her life. He was a godsend in the truest sense of the word. She took out cold water a few times, making sure they both were able to drink as much as they wanted. Baking cookies seemed to be a good thing, and she called them in a couple of hours before supper to serve them their treats along with big glasses of milk. Walt looked to be in his element. He had become Earl's shadow, and surprisingly, Earl was even more patient with the boy than Howard had been. She was starting to think Earl was perfect, but then she remembered that he'd been known as a member of the demon horde. It made her smile to think of him misbehaving as he readily admitted he had. By supper time, Walt could barely keep his eyes open. It wasn't that Earl had let him do any truly difficult work, but that he wasn't used to hurrying around and helping as much as he was. Even when she'd taken him on the range, she'd made sure Walt didn't do too much. Earl seemed to think it was fine to push the boy past his comfort zone, and Charlotte was pleased to see her son doing so well. As they sat down, Earl said, "Don't go falling asleep now, Walt. I still need your help with the milking." Walt nodded, but he seemed to be fighting to keep his eyes open. Charlotte knew he would sleep late into the day on Monday, but that wasn't a bad thing as far as she was concerned. She'd simply served what was left of the chicken and dumplings from the night before, and Walt had been as eager to eat them again as he had the first time. "What do you think I should cook for this supper party you have planned?" Earl shrugged. "I have no idea. I think I'm going to smoke some beef, so if you want to do potatoes and green beans or something, that would be perfect. I know the other ladies will handle the bread and dessert, so you don't need to worry about that. In all the years I was married to Howard, he never once invited anyone to have supper with us. I always wondered if he was a little bit ashamed of me." "Did you go to church together on Sundays?" Charlotte nodded. "Truly, it was the only thing we did out of the house together." "He wasn't ashamed of you then." "If he had been, he'd have found an excuse to miss church and let you and Walt go on your own." "That makes sense," she said. After supper, Walt went out to help with the milking. He looked like he was about to fall over, and Charlotte started to suggest he go straight to bed, but Earl must have read her mind because he shook his head. When they came back in, Earl picked Walt up and praised him for putting in a day of men's work. "You did everything I asked you to do. I'm really proud of you, Walt. You're going to grow into a hardworking man, and that's all a papa can ask for from his son." Walt preened at the words, resting his head on Earl's shoulder. "I think we should take our hardworking man and put him to bed," Charlotte said, grinning. The way Earl handled Walt was amazing. He was so good with her boy. Walt snuggled into his bed, too tired to keep his eyes open for another minute. Charlotte smiled down at him and kissed his cheek. "Love you, Walt. We'll see you in the morning." Once they were out of the room, Charlotte shook her head. "I never would have pushed him so hard. Did you see how tired he was?" He was tired, but he was also proud of himself. "I have a theory, and I'm going to see how it works." "What is that?" she asked. "I think if he gets too tired from me pushing him too much, he'll speak up. I just need you to stand back and let it happen." She bit her lip, leading the way into the parlor, where they'd taken to spending their time after Walt went to bed. "I'll try. It just doesn't seem like a great idea to me." Earl shrugged. "Give me a week. If it doesn't work, then I'll stop." Charlotte was surprised she trusted him so much, but she readily agreed. "All right. I can do that. Thank you. I really want to help Walt as much as I can." "I know you do. Thank you for that." I don't think you have any idea how much I appreciate you treating him as your own. It's how I think of him, Earl said, sitting on the sofa. He wasn't sure if he wanted her on the chair or sitting beside him so they could snuggle together. It felt like it might be time for them to grow closer. He'd only been there for a couple of days, but they seemed to be getting along much better than he'd ever expected. Charlotte moved to sit beside him on the sofa, sitting close beside him. Without thinking, he put his arm around her shoulders. I think church went well this morning, she said. I was a little surprised when you started inviting half the congregation to supper on Saturday night, but I'm looking forward to it. Good. I was afraid I was trapping you into doing something you'd hate. She laughed. I don't know, do I? I've never been to someone's house for supper or invited anyone to mine. It'll be a fresh new experience. You've never gone to supper at someone's house? Not ever? His family hadn't been terribly social, but they had at least had friends they'd shared meals with on occasion. Never having had that experience seemed crazy to Earl. She shook her head. Growing up, we were around people as little as possible, for fear they'd realize I was a girl, and I'd be taken away. Then as an adult, my mother-in-law spent time with us, but she hated me, and it showed in everything she said and did. I was happy when she went back to Connecticut. Did Howard come from money? He asked. It seemed to make sense from the little he'd heard about her first husband. He did. His mother saw him as someone who would be a lawyer or a banker someday, and he ended up in the West ranching. She said it made her stomach turn to see him throwing his life away the way he was. She sounds like a lovely woman. I so wish I could meet her. The sarcasm was so thick in his voice that Charlotte could do nothing but laugh. I managed to get through it all. As soon as I was expecting, she said she'd taught me all she could and went home. She never did meet Walt, which is just fine with me. She'd have found fault with him simply because he was my child. Earl toward her, sighing. I wish the first half of your life had been as good as I plan to make the rest of it. She smiled at that. You really are a good man, Earl. I'm glad you were the one to respond to my letter. My sister said she read it and knew it was meant for me. I almost refused to read it at all. She sent some of our brothers to marry before, and I didn't want to be just another Miller brother expected to marry a stranger. He shook his head, caressing her cheek with the back of one finger. She was right though. I felt you calling to me with that letter. I knew I was meant to be your husband. You really don't mind my reputation, do you? I think your reputation is ridiculous. People can think what they like about you, and I'll still be at your side. I promised for better or for worse, and this is for worse. He leaned down and brushed his lips softly against hers. I think I'm ready to be more familiar. She raised an eyebrow. I'm not ready for you in my bed yet. That's just fine with me. I'm not ready for that either. I am, however, ready for just a bit of kissing and touching. She smiled. That sounds good to me. Turning more fully toward him on the sofa, she touched his cheek with her fingers, feeling the stubble that came from not having shaved in a while. Are you growing a beard? He shrugged. I thought I might. Beards seem to be the norm around here. Why should I be different? Back east, most men are clean-shaven, it seems. At least that's how it is in Beckham. But here? I can let my beard grow to the middle of my chest, and no one will think a thing of it. I think I like it, Charlotte told him, wondering if her opinion would affect what he did. Then I'll keep it. You just let me know when it gets too long, and I'll consider trimming it. My opinion matters? She asked. Earl nodded, smiling. You're my wife. You have to look at me more than anyone else does. Of course, your opinion matters. She laughed at that. Then I'll let you know what my opinion is as soon as I've figured it out. He leaned toward her then, pressing his lips against hers again. There had been little kissing between him and Patsy because of her history with men, but kissing Charlotte felt right. Absolutely perfect. Charlotte put her hands on his shoulders and tilted her head, inviting him to deepen the kiss. His touch made her feel so much, more than Howard's ever had, which made her feel both guilty and excited at the same time. His kiss made it feel as if something was singing through her body. It felt so good, and she wondered how it would feel to have him within her. All at once, that's what she wanted, to make love with her new husband. When he raised his head, she wanted to yell that she wasn't finished yet, but instead she stared at him through heavy-lidded eyes. "I think I like kissing you, husband." "I certainly hope so." "I enjoy kissing you too." He rested his forehead against hers. "I should head to bed, but let's meet here at the same time tomorrow night and do this all over again." She laughed softly. "I'd be happy to oblige." She watched him as he walked toward the stairs to go up to bed. For a second, she considered inviting him to sleep in her bed instead, but she decided it was better this way. If they took things slowly, then they would both be ready when they did finally make love. It just wouldn't be tonight. Asterisk. By the end of their first full week together, Charlotte was in a tizzy. She had never felt so much passion for anyone in her life, and she was ready to share Earl's bed. Their kisses after Walt went to bed, along with their discussions about anything and everything under the sun, made her feel closer to Earl than she ever had anyone in her life. On Saturday, he got up early and started a fire in the pit he'd dug the day before, putting a grate over it that he'd found in the barn when he'd been cleaning it earlier in the week. Then he placed the huge slab of meat on the grate to smoke all day long. He'd come back and stoke the fire every couple of hours. He knew he could ask Charlotte to do it, but he was excited to do it himself. Once everything was set up just like he wanted it, he went inside to have breakfast. Charlotte made biscuits with a sausage gravy and scrambled eggs. It wasn't something he'd ever had for breakfast, but he had to admit, it was absolutely wonderful. After breakfast, he kissed his wife goodbye, each morning kiss lasting longer than the last. "It's hard not to linger here with you all day. Soon, it won't matter if you want to wait. I'll be dragging you off to your bed before you can say no." With that, he put his hat on his head and left to start the day with his men, all of whom were still helping him with the roundup of the calves. Charlotte stood staring at the closed door behind him, and she realized that they both were ready for a more intimate relationship, but neither was ready to say it. Now that she knew, she'd act accordingly. Saturday was laundry day for her, so she got that out of the way first thing, and then she began the process of carrying everything Earl had brought with him down the stairs to her room. Maybe when he realized that all his belongings were where they belonged, he'd join them. You never could tell though. She'd seen a stubborn streak in the man over their time together. When Walt woke, it was almost noon. He was sleeping later and later, but not a word had been spoken yet. Earl swore he'd seen his mouth move like he was about to say something, but he'd closed it without a word. "Do you want breakfast or lunch?" Charlotte asked him. When he didn't respond, she sighed. "Do you want breakfast?" "I made biscuits and gravy." He shook his head. "Do you want to wait to eat with Earl?" Walt nodded, smiling. "You like your new papa a lot, don't you?" He nodded again. "You know, Papa has never heard you talk. I think your voice is the most beautiful sound in the whole world. He would love to hear it, just like I do. Do you think maybe you can talk for him?" Walt tilted his head to one side, seeming to consider what she said. Finally, he shrugged. She gave him a biscuit so he wouldn't be too hungry while they waited for Earl to eat with them, but she hoped they were getting through to him. Hopefully, Walt would soon discover that he had things that needed to be said. After the wash was finished drying, she folded it and put it away, giving the house a good scrubbing. Not that it was dirty, but with company coming, she wanted it to be as clean as it could possibly be. While she worked, Walt followed behind her, taking on little chores. "Would you wipe up the muddy footprints in front of the door?" she asked. Walt nodded, rushing to do her bidding. She had a light lunch of soup and sandwiches waiting, so whenever Earl came back, she would be ready to feed him. The man seemed to always be hungry, but he cooked more than his fair share, and she had no complaints. He was good for her, and he was good to her. When Earl came in, he looked exhausted. "Did something happen?" she asked, hurrying to him. He shook his head. "I had to fire another of the men today, which makes us all have to work just a bit harder." She frowned. "Over me?" He chuckled. "Not this time." He wasn't doing his job properly, using spurs on his horse. "I don't care who he is. No one is going to abuse an animal around me." "Good for you." She kissed him softly. "Sit down, and I'll have lunch on the table in a minute." "Everything's ready." He removed his hat and sat down, looking at Walt, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "How are you doing today, Walt?" Walt just smiled. Earl took that as good and took a bite of the soup. It was a hearty chicken with rice soup, and it was wonderful. "It's the end of May. When is it going to stop frosting overnight?" Charlotte laughed. "It'll do it some all through the summer. Montana can never decide if it's summer or winter, it seems. I've seen snow every month of the year here. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I mean, I'll be happy not to have the heat of the summer on me, but a break from frosts would be nice. I hope they don't hurt my garden." She'd already figured out how much he loved that garden of his, so she simply agreed. "Hopefully not." As soon as he was gone after lunch, she got back to work scrubbing. It was going to be a long day of hard work. But she wasn't sure if there was any other kind of day. Chapter 7. Earl finished work early for the day, and immediately checked on his meat. He wanted it perfectly tender, not burnt. It seemed good to him, so he headed inside the house to check on Charlotte and Walt. Walt was standing on a chair turned backwards, helping Charlotte mash the potatoes she'd made for their guests. She turned her head to receive Earl's kiss. "How was your day?" He nodded. "Ready for branding on Monday and Tuesday?" "I think. I hope." He grinned. "Never having done it, I have no idea how to tell whether we're ready or not." "I'm sure you are. You're not the type of man to leave anything to chance." "No, I'm not." He ran his fingers through his hair. "Meat is just about done. I'm going to need something to carry it in from the fire." It was colder that day, seeming to hover barely above freezing, which did not bode well for the planting he wanted to do the following day. "Good. I'll have everything in here done in the next few minutes. I made carrots, peas, green beans, and mashed potatoes. There's plenty of everything. I can't believe I'm so nervous." She lifted Walt off the chair onto the floor and wiped her hands on her apron. "What time is everyone supposed to be here?" "In about 15 minutes, he said." "Do you have a roasting pan I can use?" She nodded, going to the pantry beside the kitchen to get it for him. "Will this work?" He nodded, carrying it outside. "This would be good for turkey for Thanksgiving too," he called over his shoulder, before realizing she and Walt had followed him. "I use it for that. We didn't bother with Thanksgiving last year, but I'm feeling a great deal more thankful this year than I was then." "You should have sent for me sooner," he told her. "It makes me sad to think of how hard you worked for a full year." "It was my choice," she said. "I could have sold it all. There were men wanting to buy." "I'm sure there were." He shook his head. "You have a wonderful location here, with the Royal River cutting through the property. Water seems to be in great demand here, and I'm just happy we don't have to fight for it." She nodded. When Howard bought this place, he made sure to buy the land that held the river upstream as well. "This river starts at the top of that mountain over there, then goes through our property, and then cuts through Wade and Ada's, and then through the Royals. I think it even goes through Cauldron Valley Ranch and the Callender's property, she said, pointing. He'd read a dime novel about how men would dam up rivers so they wouldn't flow to other people's properties. He made sure that would never happen to him. Earl smiled. How long did he live here before the two of you got married? Only about a year. She watched him as he put the meat from the grill into the roasting pan and carried it inside, with Walt a step behind him the whole way. Walt, you need to go comb your hair. Our guests will be here soon. Walt didn't seem to know what to make of the idea they would have guests, but he hurried out of the room and did as he was told. Earl took the opportunity to put his arms around his wife. You're not nervous about tonight, are you? Me? Nervous about the first time I will ever have guests in my home. Oh, of course not. She grinned at him, wrapping her arms around his neck. I have a secret that I'm going to share with you as soon as everyone has gone home. Oh? Tell me now. I don't like secrets. Sorry. You're just going to have to wait. She heard a wagon pull into the yard, and she extricated herself from his arms. Someone's here. We're expecting people. Don't seem so shocked. She sighed. I've never done this before. Why are we doing this again? So we can get to know our friends and neighbors and form closer bonds with them. That way, if anything happens to either one of us, the other will have people to rely on. Charlotte walked to the door and opened it wide, seeing that it was Ada, with Wade and the baby. As promised, she carried a basket that Charlotte had to assume was filled with bread. Wade carried the baby. I didn't think to ask if babies were invited, Wade said, but we thought it was best if we didn't leave her home alone. Earl sighed. I suppose we'll have to put up with her then. Ada stepped into the house and smiled. Your home is beautiful, Charlotte. So clean. Walt and I scrubbed all day. Charlotte shook her head. I probably shouldn't have said that and just pretended my home is always spotless. Ada laughed. With as much as you had to work on the ranch in the past year, if your home was always spotless, I would think you never slept. I barely slept as it was, Charlotte agreed with a laugh. Another wagon pulled into the yard and Charlotte and Ada both turned to greet Cassandra and Cameron, as well as Cameron's mother. We're certainly going to have a full house tonight, Charlotte said. She'd never once had the opportunity to use her dining room, finding it easier to eat in the kitchen since it was just the three of them. There was a beautiful oak table with 10 chairs in the dining room, however, and she was excited to use it for the first time. She'd even set the table with her best dishes. Come in. Cassandra walked up to the house carrying the baby, while Mrs. Royal carried 2 pies. I thought we might want 2 pies with so many of us, Mrs. Royal said, looking excited to be invited for supper. Your home is just beautiful, Charlotte. Oh, thank you, Charlotte said. Please come in, and we'll eat while the food is hot. As everyone sat at the dining table, Charlotte carried in all the dishes. She was happy to have everyone at her home now that it was actually happening, and she didn't have to fret about it. Once everything was on the table, Charlotte took her seat at the foot of the table, while Earl sat at the head. They bowed their heads, and Earl prayed for good fellowship, a filling meal, and a good branding. The men immediately dominated the conversation. You haven't done your branding and castration yet? Cameron asked. Earl shook his head. Give me a minute. I've only been here a week, and I was a farmer back in Beckham. This whole ranching thing is new to me. Do you need help? Wade asked. I would be happy to come lend my expertise for the day. Cameron nodded. I would too. Wade was my foreman for a long time, and he knows how to lead men. It might be easier for you to have backup the first time. Earl looked between the 2 men. Do you think it would make me look weak in front of the men? Cameron laughed. All any of the men could talk about at church last week was you knocking Johnny on his backside, repeatedly. No one is going to think you're weak after that. Trust me. Looking sheepish, Earl rubbed the back of his neck. I was defending my wife's honor. About time too, Cameron said. Between you and me, I think her first husband encouraged all the rumors. He didn't want there to be competition for her. Earl's eyes widened and he quickly glanced down at his wife, who was engrossed in a conversation with the women, and obviously hadn't heard. He'd had a feeling life between Charlotte and Howard hadn't been as perfect as she made it seem. Not now, he said softly, and Cameron nodded, looking a bit embarrassed. Walt sat next to Earl, watching his every move, and Earl was worried the boy had heard what Cameron had said about his father. No one should have to be disillusioned about their father that way. Hopefully he hadn't caught it. Walt's been a huge help to me around here, showing me the ropes. He milks the cow every night, and he even helped me plow a patch for our kitchen garden. Walt's face lit up at the praise. Is that so? Wade asked. I sure wish I had a helper like that. I just have a girl. And a beautiful girl at that, Cameron said, nodding toward the wives. She sure is a beauty, Earl replied. I think I'm luckier though, because I have a man who is willing to work at my side. Right, Walt? Walt nodded, looking excited. After supper, the men went outside to talk while the ladies worked together to get the dishes done. You don't have to help me, Charlotte protested for what seemed like the 100th time. If you come to my house for supper, I sure hope you won't leave me with all the dishes, Ada said. It's better this way. We all help each other out. Cassandra nodded. I'll wash, Ada will dry, and you put everything away because you know where it goes. Mrs. Royal sat at the kitchen table, a baby on each knee. I'll just sit here with the babies. Cassandra smiled at her mother-in-law. I know that's where you're happiest. Where's Walt? Charlotte asked, only then realizing he was missing. Oh, I'm sure he's out with the men, Ada said. He seems to be really taken with Earl. He is. I never dreamed he'd latch onto him that way. From the instant we laid eyes on him, Walt has only wanted to be close to him. Every morning he searches the house for him, and I have to remind him that he's out working on the ranch. Cassandra laughed. I guess that's better than hating him, isn't it? Oh, I'm not complaining one little bit. Earl is really good with him and treats him as if he was his own child. Charlotte couldn't believe how entwined her life had become with Earl's, even though he'd only been there for a week. Mrs. Royal said from the table, That's wonderful. I was raised by my father and my stepmother, and she made it clear every day until I moved out that she didn't like me, and I had no right to be there. I'm glad Earl knows how to show love to your son. Me too, Charlotte said. She'd never even thought about how bad it could be until her new husband arrived. She didn't know what she would have done if he hadn't accepted Walt as his own. She'd been very fortunate with the man who had come to marry her. When the women finished with the dishes, the men came back inside and they all talked for a short while, but again, they seemed to split between men and women. It was something Charlotte had never noticed before. Why do the men talk to just the other men, and the women to just the other women? She finally asked after observing the odd split. Mrs. Royal was the one to respond. The men have more in common to discuss. They talk about the weather and ranching, among other things. We women don't have a lot of interest in those things, but we can talk about our favorite receipts and what kind of sewing projects we have coming up as well as the children. Well, we can talk about anything we want, but you'll notice those have been our main topics of conversation tonight. Charlotte thought about it for a moment. You're right. And when I catch the odd word the men are saying, they do seem to be talking a lot about the branding on Monday. I guess it makes sense. I've just never noticed it before. Ada laughed. Oh, it happens at every party. Back east when I was going to dance after dance, the men would only talk to the ladies if they were asking them to dance. My mother could never figure out why I couldn't find a man that way. I kept telling her I wanted to know more about a man than how well he could waltz. The other women laughed. Finally, Cassandra stood. It's getting late, and we have church in the morning. I think we need to say goodnight. Charlotte got to her feet as well. I'm so glad you all came, she said. I've never had so much fun in my life. Ada and Cassandra shared a look. We're going to invite you to make jam with us this summer, Cassandra said. Then you'll see what fun really is. Charlotte realized then what she'd been missing out on. Now she had real friends, and it would keep her going no matter what. As the others left, she looked down at Walt. I think it's time for you to go to bed. Walt looked annoyed, but he was obedient as always, allowing Earl to carry him to his room. After they'd said their goodnights, they closed the door behind them, and Charlotte turned to Earl. Ready for your surprise? Chapter 8. I thought it was a secret. The look Earl gave Charlotte was about her confusion. It's both. She took his hand and pulled him toward her bedroom, and his eyes widened. When she opened her door, and he could see his things scattered about in her room, including a photograph of Patsy, he froze. I can't do this yet, he said, shaking his head. Especially not with Patsy watching. He turned and hurried away from her, going to the barn to milk Sally. Once he reached the barn, he heaved a deep breath. He was torn. More than anything in the world, he wanted to make love with his wife, but the memories of Patsy and her love for him weren't going anywhere. He stared at the cow for a good long while, before pulling up the three-legged milking stool and grabbing the milk pail from its hook on the wall. His motions were slow and deliberate as he thought about the last time he saw his sweet Patsy's face. Did it mean he was giving up on their love if he was physical with another woman? Of course, the other woman was his wife, and someone he had deep respect for, but he wasn't yet in love with Charlotte. Maybe that should be his line. As soon as he loved Charlotte, and he didn't think that moment was far into the future, then he would make love with his wife. He thought for a moment about how Charlotte would feel about Patsy. Without a doubt, he knew the two of them would become friends, forming a barrier against the outside world that had treated them so poorly. Patsy was never able to find love and encouragement after her return from slavery. And that's exactly what she'd been. A slave to several men who passed her around, sharing her sexual favors. Without that love and support she'd needed so badly from someone other than him, she hadn't been able to bear to stay in the world who saw her so poorly. Earl couldn't stop thinking about his last conversation with her. She'd tried to call off their wedding. We can't get married, Earl. No one in this town will ever see me as anything but a fallen woman. They look at me and imagine the different men I've been with, and they think so much less of me. Then we'll go get some land from Uncle Sam. I hear there's still plenty of land out west, free for anyone who is willing to stake their claim and prove up their property. I've been looking into it. I know that if we're away from people who know you, we're going to have a perfect marriage. He tried to kiss her, but she'd turned her head. That's not the only problem. I don't know if I could be with another man after the way they treated me. I'm not them. I'll give you as much time as you need. He gazed deeply into her troubled brown eyes. Patsy, you know we can be happy, if we can just get away from the people in this town who think so little of you. I don't know why you don't think little of me. She shook her head. I'm going away for the weekend to the shore with my mother and sisters. I'll do a lot of thinking there, and I hope I can come to some conclusions about what I need to do with my life. I don't know why you're questioning this all of a sudden, Earl said, feeling like she was taking back her words of love and her vow to be his wife. It's not all of a sudden. I've always questioned it. I remember telling you when you asked me to marry you that I wasn't sure we could make it work. Remember? Her hand had gone to his cheek, and he could tell she was trying to soften the blow. He frowned. When you come back, you'll feel better about everything. You know how much you've always loved the ocean." She smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I have always loved the ocean." She stood on tiptoe and kissed his cheek. "I do love you with everything inside of me. And I love you. See? It's working out already." It was the last time he'd seen her. Other than her funeral, of course, but he hadn't seen her then. Just the cold box that they'd buried her in. He liked to pretend that last conversation had never happened between them. That they'd been in love, and everything was going to be perfect. Looking back at it, he knew better. Of course, he could see everything clearly now. But then, he'd been so sure their love could heal any wound she bore from her ordeal. The news of her death had shaken him to the core. He couldn't help but wonder if she'd drowned herself to keep him from feeling the hurt of her refusal to marry him. Of course, that wouldn't be the only reason, but Patsy had been through so much, and she'd been unsure she could ever live a normal life. She'd said even her sisters looked at her strangely, as if they didn't know the woman she'd become. And Earl had ignored it all, convinced that he could heal her. But it wasn't possible. He didn't know details of the year and a half she'd been gone, and he didn't want to know. The way she'd been treated had been beyond anything a woman should experience. He finished milking Sally and walked toward the house, wondering what on earth he should say to Charlotte. Patsy was his past, and Charlotte was his future, but sometimes he felt as if Patsy's ghost stood right between them. Perhaps telling her that would help, but he knew she was grieving as well. Once inside, he realized the house was completely quiet, and thought Charlotte must have gone to bed. He poured the milk into a pitcher and put the pitcher into the icebox. When he turned away from the icebox, there she was, standing in the middle of the kitchen. "I'm sorry if you felt like I was trying to push you into something you weren't ready for," Charlotte said softly. She was in her nightgown, but he could see how red her eyes were. She'd been crying, and it was his fault. "You did nothing wrong. I feel so much for you, but it's passion. It's not love like I felt for Patsy, and I feel like I'm betraying her for even considering marrying another woman." Charlotte nodded. "I've spoken a lot about Howard. Why don't you tell me about Patsy?" She took his hand and led him into the parlor, sitting beside him on the sofa, ready to listen. What did she look like? She was the most beautiful girl in all of Beckham. Her hair was brown, as were her eyes. I swear she looked like someone who had just stepped out of a storybook. When she got back from what I like to term her ordeal, she had a scar on her forehead, near her hairline. It was the only way she was different physically. Charlotte gripped his hand tightly, knowing this conversation was difficult for him. "How did she get the scar?" He looked at her for a moment, startled. "I don't know. I never thought to ask. I just kissed the scar, and I told her our love would mend all her scars." She frowned. "How long was she back before you began courting her?" "We were courting before she was taken, and then as soon as she came back, we resumed our relationship, of course. I knew that people didn't think much of her, so I asked her to marry me. I knew if she was in a good relationship, people wouldn't look down on her the way they did." Charlotte shook her head. "It doesn't work that way. I know that now. She came to me to break off our engagement right before she left with her family to go to the coast. It was always her favorite thing to do, be near the ocean, and her family would go for a week every summer. She told me that she didn't think it would work for her to be married at all, but I argued with her. I told her that our love could fix everything wrong with her." "Go on." "I found out just days later that she'd drowned in the ocean. No one told me if it was an accident or not. I think they feared I would blame myself if it wasn't. And I did blame myself." He shook his head. "I realize now, I never should have pushed her to even try to have a life with me. Not with all she'd been through." "Do you still love her?" Charlotte asked. He thought about that for a long moment before answering. I think I love the idea of her. I loved the girl she was before everything happened, and when she got back, I just wanted to fix her and make everything right again. Which makes a lot of sense. You are the kind of man who wants to fix those around him and make everything better. I don't know that she could be better after what happened to her. I don't know either, but I had to try. But maybe I should have been a little less forceful in my attempt. You can't blame yourself. You were doing everything you thought was right to make her happy again. Charlotte sighed. It must have been a very difficult situation for everyone involved. How did your parents feel about you marrying her? My parents were very hands-off about everything after their first 4 children. I don't remember ever being disciplined as a child, unless one of my older sisters did it. Earl shook his head. Her parents were very protective of her. She and her sisters always walked in pairs, and they were never alone outside the house. They came from a wealthier family, not like the family Ada came from, but definitely wealthier than mine. She and her sister were walking together, and something caught her eye in a store window. She stopped to look, and it took a minute for her sister to even realize she was missing. When she did realize, Patsy was gone. I'm sure that was really hard for her sister. Do you ever wonder about your parents? The people who gave birth to you? Why were you left on the side of the road? She shook her head. I've always wondered. There may be a woman out there who is heartbroken, looking for her child still. Or there may have been 7 of us, and I was the one who got forgotten as they left, and by the time they came back, I was gone. More likely, I was one too many mouths to feed, or my mother wasn't married. It doesn't really matter now. I guess not. But he had to wonder if there was a way to go about finding her parents. He stopped himself though. If he and Patsy had moved west, it would have been to escape the past. There was no reason for him to dredge up the past for someone else. So, it sounds like you did some soul-searching outside, am I right? He nodded. I thought about everything that's happened to both of us over the years. I want to make love with you. More than anything else in the world. But I need you to know I'm not sure I love you yet. I don't know if I love you either. But we're married, and I see no harm in finding comfort in each other's arms. It wouldn't bother you? He was growing more excited by the idea every minute. Not at all. I think it's something that will come very naturally between us. We enjoy touching each other and kissing one another. Why wouldn't we want to make love? She shrugged. I didn't love Howard when I married him. It came with time. We married because I wanted to be respectable, and he was looking for a wife. Do you ever regret marrying him? She shook her head. No, because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have Walt, and that boy is everything to me. Earl smiled at that. I think he's pretty darn special too. I just wish he'd speak. I think he's close. I don't know why he stopped talking. He took a deep breath. How would you feel if I slept in my own bed tonight, and maybe we plan to make love tomorrow night? Or even the next? Maybe it should be my celebration after branding. I don't want you to think I'm not attracted to you, because that's not it at all. I want you. I just have to get my mind to quit making me feel like I'm betraying Patsy. She nodded. I think that sounds good. I'm sorry if it felt like I was rushing you. That was never my intention. When you said that you had been thinking about it this morning, I took that as an invitation, and I shouldn't have. He leaned down and brushed his lips across hers. Thank you so much for understanding. Of course. I know Howard would have wanted me to remarry. Not for Walt, but for the sake of the ranch. He would have hated all of his years of hard work to have gone down the drain. Earl was again perplexed by her relationship with her first husband. Something wasn't right there, and he didn't think she even realized it. Chapter 9. After 2 days of branding and castrating calves, Earl felt like he'd been trampled by the entire herd. He walked into the house, shaking his head. I've never dreamed of working that hard in my life. It was late Tuesday night, and Charlotte had supper ready for him, as she always did. Once he was seated, she put supper on the table in front of him, Walt watching him as if he was a hero. "Fried chicken?" he asked. "You remembered." He'd told her during one of their late-night talks that fried chicken with mashed potatoes and gravy was his favorite meal. She smiled. "Of course, I did. Besides, I think Walt is going to love it." "He's never had fried chicken?" Earl asked, surprised. "Why have you been depriving this boy his entire life?" "This is my first time to make it," she admitted. "I had Mrs. Royal write down a receipt for it on Sunday so I could make it as a celebration meal when branding was finally over." She shook her head. "I cannot express how thankful I am that you were here in time for me not to have to do it alone. It was a huge job for more than 20 men. What would it have been like to do it alone?" he asked. "I don't even want to think about it. We don't have to, since you came to my rescue and handled it for me." She sat down across from him and joined hands with him and Walt for their prayer. Once they'd said their amens, Earl took his first bite of the chicken and sighed happily. "It's delicious." "Oh, good. I was worried you wouldn't like it." She'd given Walt a drumstick, thinking it would be the easiest thing for him to eat, and he had lifted it and started gnawing at it. "Do you like it, Walt?" The boy nodded. When she tried it, she smiled. "I'll have to make this again. I've never tried fried chicken, but it's rather good." Earl gaped at Charlotte. "You've never even eaten fried chicken?" She shook her head. "The man who raised me wasn't fond of chicken, so he told me not to cook those receipts in the book. Howard never asked for it, so I never even thought about fixing it. It wasn't even in my mind that chicken could be fried. But you make delicious chicken and dumplings. They were a meal that Howard's mother was fond of, and I learned to make them from her. Then Walt loved them, so I kept making them." She shrugged. "I don't have a lot of experience with food or anything else. The only towns I've ever been to are Mountain Home and Cauldron Valley. I've been inside one church. Never went to school." She shrugged. "Maybe someday, I'll get to experience more things. We're going to have to find a foreman we trust, so we can head back east on the train. I think visiting my family for a week would be just the kind of thing we'd both enjoy. I'm not sure I want this demon horde of yours around Walt." He laughed. They would just show him how to have a good time. You know, snakes and frogs in the teacher's desk, tying people into outhouses. Good clean fun. You should be ashamed you ever even considered those things fun. Probably. And yet, I'm not. Earl winked at her, and Charlotte couldn't help but laugh. Walt looked back and forth between the two of them as if he was trying to figure out what was so funny. "Do you want to go visit my family, Walt? There are children your age who would love to play." Walt shook his head adamantly. Charlotte was surprised. "You don't like other children?" she asked. He shook his head again. Earl had to wonder what was going on in the boy's head. There was something he couldn't figure out how to tell them. Earl was certain of it. Walt followed along to help milk the cow as he usually did that night, and Earl decided to ask some questions and see what would happen. "Have other children been mean to you?" he asked. Walt shook his head, his eyes going to something on the wall behind Earl. When Earl turned his head to see what it was, there was nothing there but some old, broken reins. Earl set up the stool and handed Walt the pail, and the boy milked the cow carefully, just as he'd been taught. While he milked, Earl kept trying. "Walt, why don't you talk?" Walt shrugged. "Are you afraid to talk?" Walt nodded. Earl wasn't sure why a boy his age would ever be afraid to talk, but he knew he had to keep pressing, since Walt was finally answering questions in his own way. "You know that there's nothing to be afraid of here, right?" Walt's eyes went again to the wall of the barn, and Earl looked at the rain. He reached out and touched it, and Walt covered his head with both arms. Earl suddenly understood. Did someone hit you with this? He left the rain where it was, and went to kneel beside the boy on the hard floor of the barn. Walt nodded. Papa. Your father hit you with this? That's terrible. Walt, I promise you, I will never hit you. Do you understand? Walt nodded, tears streaming down his face. Earl gathered the boy to him and got to his feet, carrying him to the house. He'd go back and finish milking Sally in a bit. Walt was more important at that moment. When they reached the kitchen, Charlotte turned from the dishes with a smile. Finished so soon? Earl nodded. Walt just told me something. Charlotte dried her hands on her apron and looked excited. He spoke? Yes, he did. He told me his papa hit him with the horse rein. What? Charlotte was shocked. Howard hadn't been the type of man to hit children. She knew he wasn't. That's not possible. Walt pulled away from Earl's shoulder. He did, he shouted at his mother. Oh, Walt. I believe you, sweetheart. She took her son from Earl's arms and held him close. When did he do that? Howard hadn't spent much time with Walt, other than in the evenings a couple times a week. He would take Walt out to milk the cow with him. I'm so sorry, baby. I didn't know. He made me promise not to tell. He said I was a bad boy. Charlotte shook her head. You've always been a good boy. Every single day. I don't know why he would say that to you. Or hurt you. I wish you could have told me. I was afraid. I understand that. Are you afraid still? A little. It seemed as if the dam had broken, and Walt was willing to say anything now. Are you afraid of me? Walt shook his head, his hair flopping, and Charlotte thought once again it was time to cut his hair. Are you afraid of Earl? He's my new papa. I love him. Earl felt tears prickling the back of his eyes, and his throat felt so tight. I love you too, Walt. Don't ever forget it. What are you afraid of then? The thing he hit me with. Walt seemed to know exactly why he was afraid. And my other papa. You know papa can't come back and hurt you, right? Walt shrugged. People can't come back and hurt others. Not after they die. It's not possible. Listening to her words of comfort to Walt, Earl thought about them himself. Patsy's death couldn't keep hurting him unless he let it. She wasn't going to come back and kill herself again. She was at peace, and that meant he needed to be ready to move on and become a real part of this little family. I promise, Walt, if anyone ever tries to hurt you again, all you have to do is tell me, Earl said. I'll knock them down. Walt giggled. You can do that? I sure can. I'm strong from working so hard. Just like you are. You have to be strong enough to tell Mama and me when something bad happens, so we can take care of you. You can't be afraid all the time. Walt seemed to consider what Earl was saying. I will. Now, I think it's time for a certain young man to go to bed. I have to milk Sally. Earl smiled. You're right. You do. Come on. Let's go get that cow taken care of so we can have some milk with our breakfast. He took Walt's hand and the two of them headed out to the barn to take care of the cow. As Charlotte finished the dishes, she couldn't help but wonder why Howard had been cruel to Walt. There was no reason for it. He definitely wasn't the good man she'd always thought he was. She got all of the dishes put away and her kitchen was spick and span again. She wanted to go out and join Walt and Earl, but she knew it was time to let her men be together. They couldn't be a real family if they didn't spend time together. When they came back in, Walt seemed to be telling a story. And then he fell in the mud. Walt laughed uproariously at the end, and Earl joined in. Though she had no idea what had been said before, Charlotte laughed as well. It was just so nice to hear Walt talking again. And now he was speaking in full sentences, something he'd never done before. Maybe when his papa had made him promise not to tell about being hit, he'd thought he should just stop talking and not say anything at all. Earl and Charlotte tucked him into bed together, and Charlotte kissed his forehead. "Thanks for telling us what happened, Walt." Walt nodded. "It's my job to tell when people hurt me. Or if I see someone hurt someone else. It's part of being a man." Charlotte smiled and nodded. "It is." She knew those words were Earl's, but she didn't mind at all. She couldn't think of a better influence for her son. As they left Walt's room and closed the door, she flung herself into Earl's arms. "Thank you so much." "I didn't do anything," he said, but he knew differently. Pushing Walt as he had got the boy talking again and talking about things neither of the adults wanted to think about. "How do you feel about what he said?" Charlotte shook her head. "It's so hard to believe. Howard was a small man, only an inch or two taller than I am. He never seemed to be violent, and I saw him back down from several fights." "That makes sense." "It does?" "Sure. When a man is small, and he can't fight others, he sometimes looks for something smaller than him to hurt. In Howard's case, Walt was it. That's really sad. I'd rather he'd beaten me than Walt." She was livid, thinking of the man she'd been married to for 7 years, hurting her innocent child, a boy who had cared for nothing as much as pleasing others. "Would you have stayed with him if he'd beaten you?" Earl asked. She laughed. "No, I would have moved back up on top of the mountain in the cabin where I was raised, and I'd have taken my child with me. Why would I do anything else?" Earl smiled. "And that's why he didn't hit you. He knew you wouldn't stay. He had to choose a victim who wouldn't fight back, but would stick around and let it continue to happen. Walt was perfect." "How do you know all this?" He shrugged. "I've been a listener my whole life. If someone needed to get anger or sadness off their chest, I was there for them. You learn a lot that way. I guess that's better than being the town outcast." He frowned for a moment. "I wonder if there's more to that than you know. Could Howard have been saying things about you that made people avoid you?" "I don't think so. But how would she know? No one really spoke to her until the last year or a little more." "It's possible, I guess. I'll investigate, and we'll figure it out. But first, there's something else I need to do." "Oh? What's that?" He surprised her by sweeping her into his arms and carrying her into her bedroom. "I think I need to make love with my wife." "Is that so?" She grinned at him, happy that he was finally ready. "It is." He set her on the floor and leaned down, kissing her softly. "Except I don't exactly know what I'm doing. Perhaps you can help me." "I'll do my best." Her fingers went to the buttons at the collar of his shirt, and she worked her way down the front of him. "I remember what you looked like standing in my kitchen the day you arrived. I've been wanting to get your shirt off you ever since." "My shirt?" he asked. "Yeah, I really liked how you looked without it, and I was wanting to get it off again so I could see it." He shook his head. "Does that mean you were standing there with a rifle pointed at me admiring my chest?" "And shoulders," she said. "I really like your shoulders." He laughed. "I would have thought you could like the fact that I cooked for you best, but no, you like my lack of shirt. Why weren't you wearing a shirt, by the way?" He shrugged out of his shirt, turned her around, and unbuttoned the back of her dress. "The man who told me how to get here told me you'd be working on the range until late in the evening. So, I heated up water and took a bath in your kitchen while you and Walt were away. I kept thinking I heard someone, and I was worried the first time we met I'd be missing a lot more than a shirt." She laughed. "Well, I guess that makes sense. And you just never took the time to put your shirt back on? He shrugged. I was hoping you'd like my chest and shoulders. He pushed her dress off her and let it fall into a pile on the floor. You did not. No, but now I wish I had. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her passionately. Within seconds, his tongue explored her mouth even as his hands moved over her body. Her arms went around him, and she sighed contentedly. Touching him was more than anything she'd ever dreamed of. It was pure heaven as far as she was concerned. When he covered her body with his, she felt nothing but pleasure. He stumbled a little, but it didn't matter. He more than made up for his lack of knowledge with enthusiasm. Afterward, he lay beside her, with her snuggled close against him. Why did I think I needed to wait for that? If I'd known it would feel that good, I really would have been wading naked in your bathtub. She laughed. I'm not sure how Walt would have reacted. I feel like it's my job to teach Walt so many things. What would be wrong with a little education about where babies come from? In a few years, that will be appropriate. She yawned. We have to sleep. She wanted to lie there and keep touching him all night, but dawn came too early for things like that. I just want to lay here like this, and hold you forever. Charlotte liked that idea. Hold me while we sleep then. Earl smiled. You don't have to tell me twice. Chapter 10. Earl spent much of the next day asking his men questions, one-on-one. Did you know Howard? He asked repeatedly. Some had and some hadn't, but they all knew one thing about his wife's late husband. He was a mean one. He'd lost many of the men who were working for him because he'd threatened them, and once he'd even threatened to whip one of the Negroes who worked for him. What about his wife? Did he talk about her? Earl asked the man who was rapidly becoming his right hand there at the ranch. He was experienced not only with ranching, but with this ranch in particular. Peter shook his head. You don't want to know what he said about your wife. I do. People act as if she's done something evil. I need to know what was said about her so I can understand what kind of situation I'm in here. Earl knew the man would be the most likely to be the one to tell him. They'd become friends of sort in the time he'd been there. Well, according to Mr. Watkins, the old man who raised her would invite all his buddies over and they'd take turns with her while the old man watched, Peter said, not looking at Earl as he said the words. Lots of men believed it, but I wasn't so sure. She's such a pretty little thing, and she kept to herself. I don't think she could have been treated like that and ended up such a good mama to her boy. He told her that no one wanted to even talk to her because she'd worn breeches when she was young and pretended to be a boy. Pete laughed at that. It's true that she did, but we all just felt dumb that we didn't realize she was old enough to be looking like a man, and she still looked like a boy. No one blames her for that at all. So, the way she's treated is due to the things her husband said about her and nothing else? Definitely. His ma hated her something fierce. I think he told her the same things, because even at church, his ma looked at her like she'd just crawled out from under a rock. Why would a man speak that way about his own wife? Earl knew the story was a lie, but he wasn't terribly surprised to hear that Howard had told it. The man was pure evil as far as he could see. He was just glad that he'd had the sense to treat Charlotte well. At least she felt she'd been treated well. He wanted to keep her for himself. He was old and not too good-looking. Short little thing. Ugly as sin. Still not sure why she married him, but he made sure she wouldn't marry no one else after him. I can see that. Good thing I didn't hear the rumors, isn't it? Sure is, boss. With that, Peter moved on down the fence they were mending, working on his own. Earl wasn't certain if he should tell Charlotte the truth about the rumors spread about her, but he finally decided she had a right to know. She'd believed for years that people looked down on her because she'd grown up wearing pants. It couldn't have been further from the truth. When he got home that day, he washed his hands at the sink, listening to Walt and Charlotte. Walt was talking up a storm, barely letting Charlotte get a word in. "You talk a lot, son." Walt giggled. "You said you wanted me to talk. Now I talk." "I see that." Earl leaned between mother and son. "What are you making for supper?" "Open-faced roast beef sandwiches with mashed potatoes and peas," Charlotte told him, turning her face to kiss her husband. "I found the receipt for it in my book, so I decided to make it. No one tells me what to cook anymore, and Walt and I felt like something new." "Right, Walt?" "That's right." Earl was thrilled the boy was talking as much as he was. It really was a huge difference, now that he'd gotten out what he was afraid of. "Well, I'm ready to try something new then." His sister Susan had often experimented with strange dishes when he was growing up. Usually, he'd even liked them. While Charlotte was putting the finishing touches on the meal, Walt jumped down and told Earl all about his day. "We went to visit the Mrs. Royals for a minute, and they have kittens. 4 of them. They don't need 4 kittens when we don't even have one." "That's very true," Earl said, knowing where the conversation was going, but he liked cats, so he wasn't going to complain even one little bit. "Was there one you liked better than the others?" Walt nodded. "There was a little gray and white kitty, and I think she should come live at our house. I asked Mama, but she said you would have to be asked about it. So, I'm asking. Can I have a kitten? How much do they want for it?" Earl asked Charlotte. Back east, kittens were given away, but here, they seemed to be a commodity. Everyone needed a barn cat or 6. "They want to give it to Walt, because he asked so nicely," Charlotte answered. When she turned from the counter with 2 plates, he could see she had tears in her eyes. She was obviously touched by the offer. "Well, I think a kitten is a great idea. You need to have someone to keep you company while Walt and I are out doing manly things." Walt nodded. "But it'll really be my kitten, but you can play with her too, Mama." "Let's get a kitten then," Charlotte said with a smile. "I've always wanted a pet, but Howard said cats make him sneeze." "Dogs too." "Well, they don't make me sneeze, and I think a kitten or 6 would make all of us happy." "Can we get them all, Papa?" "I don't think we should take advantage of the Royals' generosity like that. 1 will be enough for us." Walt sighed dramatically. "How about 3? Earl laughed and ruffled the boy's hair. "We're going to start with 1. What if they make your mama sneeze, and we don't even know it? We'd have to give your mama away, and do you know how hard it is to find a new one?" Walt giggled. "Yeah, we'd keep the kitten and give Mama away." Charlotte put the last plate on the table and took her seat with her family. "You'd better find a kitten who can cook then. Maybe we should keep your Mama, don't you think? No one else cooks quite like she does." Seeming to consider it for a moment, Walt finally said, "I guess we can keep Mama." "You're so kind," Charlotte said, shaking her head. "Was it your idea to get this boy talking?" After the milking was done, they put Walt to bed together as they always did, and Earl waited until they were out of his son's room before discussing what had been on his mind all evening. "I think you need to know something I learned today." "What's that?" she asked, taking his hand and pulling him toward the parlor. What she really wanted was to simply take him to bed, but it was too early for that. "I asked the men about your husband." "And what kind of things he said about you?" "Oh. Did people think kindly of him?" Earl shook his head. "No, he was hated by pretty much everyone. They said he was mean and always threatening the men who worked for him, going so far as to threaten to whip one of them." "That's terrible. I had no idea." "There's more," he said, dreading the next part of the conversation they must have. "Worse than that?" "I think so." He shook his head. "He told everyone in town that the man who raised you would invite men over, and they would take turns with you, with the old man watching. Charlotte's jaw dropped. Why would he say things like that about his own wife? That never happened. No one ever visited. Not once. I know that, and you know that. If you'd been treated that way, you'd be scarred in ways no one can see, like my Patsy. No, he said it so no one would ever try to take you from him. Everyone said he was short and ugly. She shrugged. He certainly wasn't the most attractive man I ever met, but he wasn't a bad man. Are you sure about that? Sighing, she shook her head. No, it sounds like he was a bad man. A very bad man. I wish I'd known it was happening so I could argue with it. Does that mean that Ada and Cassandra have heard the rumors? They most likely have, I'm sorry to say. But it also means they don't believe them, or they wouldn't be spending time with you. I guess that's true. I can't believe he lied about me that way. She looked at him, a thought occurring to her. You don't believe the rumors, do you? Not one little bit. How could I? He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her toward them. And even if they were true, they wouldn't bother me. I think you're a good mother and an even better wife. It doesn't matter much what brought you to this point in your life. I will help you get rid of the rumors, though. It's the least I can do. You've been so good to Walt and me. I've never known anyone who was kind just for the sake of kindness and not trying to get something in return. I hope you realize I'm kind to you because I love you, and not just because I think I should be. He shook his head. I had no idea you and Walt would make me fall in love so quickly. She grabbed him in a bear hug, holding him close. I love you too. I thought I loved Howard, but I think I just became used to him. You? I love you with everything inside me. It shouldn't have happened so fast, but it did, and I can't regret even one moment of you in my life. Didn't we agree to go slowly on all this the day I arrived? Weren't we both in love with people who had passed? We both thought we were. Now we know better. He chuckled. I'll always love Patsy a little, but you're right. It's very different than the love I feel for you. I think I put Patsy on a pedestal. I would never do that with you, because I so badly want to drag you down and have my way with you. As long as you remember that if you have your way with me, it means I'm also having my way with you. Never thought of it that way, but I guess you're right. He leaned down and kissed her once more. Didn't you say something about wanting a daughter? I think we should go practice making one. Great idea. Charlotte jumped to her feet. Race you to the bedroom. I'll let you win, because I win either way. Earl watched her run toward the bedroom and realized that his hard-working, only serious wife had changed completely in the short while they'd been married, as had her son. He couldn't wait to see what they'd be like in a year. Epilogue. Earl stood behind his wife, who was staring out the window at the snow falling. I'm ready for spring, she complained. As I remember, spring wasn't a great deal warmer than this, he said. Besides, I think you tricked me. She turned toward him, wrapping her arms around him. How did I trick you? She wanted to pull him into the bedroom and make love with him, but she'd given birth too recently. Her midwife had told her to keep her hands off her husband for at least a little while. You told me you wanted a daughter, and I was as helpful as I could possibly be to make that happen. Oh, you were. You were absolutely wonderful. But I still don't know how I tricked you. You said you wanted one daughter. Last I counted, you gave birth to 2 of them. 2. How am I supposed to watch over both of them? She chuckled. Walt will help. He already loves them more than life itself. She rested her head against his shoulder. I sure hope we don't have 2 babies every year. I think one every couple of years would be better, but we're starting off strong. He sighed. Next time, we're not doubling up. You hear me? I guess. I do think we might need to keep our hands off each other if we want to make sure there are no more twins. Never going to happen. How much longer until we can return to our favorite activity? He asked. Midwife says 6 weeks, so that means 2 more. Charlotte sighed. I was hoping it would be yesterday. Well, I guess we want you properly healed before anything else happens. Probably. She grinned up at him, pulling his head down for a kiss. We'll have to practice kissing while we wait. I sure do love you. Did you know I almost refused to read your letter? I'm so glad I followed my heart out here and gave it to you. Charlotte smiled. I don't know what we'd do without you.